Memory Ward takes place in this small little idyllic town called Bethlehem, Nevada, and our protagonist, Hank Davies, is a postal worker, and one day he's kind of walking down doing his route, and he notices a couple letters fall out of his bag when he trips, and some curiosity strikes him, and for whatever reason, he opens one of the envelopes, and inside it's blank, and then he opens another envelope, and inside that is blank as well, and he begins to question the town that he lives in and whether something is going on and people in the town know something that he doesn't. And then one night, uh, his wife is asleep. He goes downstairs for a glass of water, and somebody knocks on his window. And he opens up the window, and a woman appears there and says, "Don't trust anybody in the town, including your wife." And then she says, "Also, the truth is behind the wallpaper." And she kind of vanishes off into the mist. And a couple nights later, he notices that the wallpaper in his room is beginning to peel. And he begins peeling back the wallpaper, and that's where the truth is written. And that's where the much of the story starts right there.
The way I wanted to start, I was planning to start with a question about the memory ward, and then I was just kind of scrolling online and looking for some like kind of final details that I didn't want to miss or get wrong. And by accident on Amazon, it loaded up. Well, not by accident. Amazon loaded up the audiobook first, and I was like, "Does that say fucking Bronson Pinchot?" And there's no way, my friend, that I can't start this conversation without acknowledging and asking you about the fact that it appears Bronson Pinchot is at least one of the voices on the audiobook for this book. So do you what's the story there?
Yeah, he's the main voice. When they told me, I guess he's been for the last decade or more, he's been a voice actor. And like I grew up watching what was the
Yeah,
TV show?
Perfect Strangers, yeah.
Perfect Strangers, yeah, where he was
Oh my
bulky,
god.
and I just assumed that was his accent, but turns out no, that was doing a fake accent. And so they just when they started doing the book, they said, "Hey, we're thinking that he would be the best guy for this," and I was like, "Hell yeah!" So they sent me some samples, and he sounded good, and so yeah, that was pretty cool.
No kidding, cuz like I know that if I were in your shoes, I would hear the name and I'd be like, selfishly I want that name attached to the thing I created, but um I'm assuming then that the samples they gave you were like, this sounds like what I was hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing. It's definitely not Balky doing his thing. So, if I hadn't known who he was, I would have been like, "Yeah, cool. This guy sounds good." And he's done so much stuff. I think he's worked with Blackstone quite a bit, so they feel comfortable
Okay.
with him. And um, but yeah, it's fun to get like a name on there.
Yeah, that's really crazy. Cause like, of course, everybody thinks about Perfect Strangers, but then you think about dude was in Beverly Hills Cop
That's true.
and dude was in True Romance. And like that's pretty awesome too.
I forgot what was he in True Romance? It's been a while since I've seen it, but
He was the assistant to the big director guy. He's the one. So, all right, and this is everybody's listening is like, why are we having on this tangent right now? But like, so Christian Slater's character, his buddy was Michael Rappaport, who was
right,
the actor,
yeah.
and that guy knew Bronson Pinchot in Hollywood, and Bronson Pinchot was the assistant to the director that they were trying to sell the drugs to. So
Ah,
he connected them to the director.
okay.
Um, so yeah, he's in like so iconic performances. Obviously, I think Perfect Strangers, but then I go to Beverly Hills Cop, and then you really can't beat a credit in True Romance.
Yeah, it's
So
impressive.
and now the Memory Ward audiobook.
Well,
So
yeah, this is probably his career highlight, I would think.
yeah, he's not going to be able to top this. Like he can retire knowing that
Yeah,
he hit the pinnacle of his career. Yeah,
that's right.
absolutely. Um, but then I also was thinking about some of the promotions that you're doing, and one of the things that I like about your social presence and everything is that you I don't want to say have a unique, but like a entertaining, like a fun approach to promoting your books when they come out. And so one thing that comes to mind is like a short video where a bunch of people kind of go run screaming out of a house, and then you just kind of wander out holding your book like open to a certain page or whatever. And I think at the end you said something like the reading's over.
Yeah, thus
Um,
ends the reading.
yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Like most of the stuff that I write is pretty dark, but I don't think I'm that dark of a person. And decided to go with my strength there on social media. And I have a buddy who's a film guy, and so I just had this concept. Of just initially, my concept was I was in the house, and then like one person ran out screaming, and then 20 seconds later, another person ran out screaming. But he's like, no, 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 have them all run out screaming at the same time. And so we did
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I followed after. But yeah, it was a fun little, you know, hour we spent filming that, and having a friend who would do it for free was helped out.
Totally. Such a simple concept and execution. Like one thing happens and then another thing happens and then you're out, but it like really kind of is effective. So yeah, I like it when people kind of think a little differently about, it's not just like a picture of your book or whatever. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good stuff.
Well, thank you.
um, and then before we start talking about the memory award, I did have one other kind of topic that has been something that I've been thinking about for a while, but haven't really had a direct ability to talk to an author about. But you definitely fit the mold, and it is that for a while, and it might still be happening now. I'm not 100% sure. American crime fiction was like really, really huge in France.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I believe you were part of that wave of American authors who, like Jake Hinkson comes to mind, and I think maybe Todd Robinson was in that kind of loop,
Yeah.
and if I'm not wrong, maybe Rob Hart, but like
Ben Whitmer was
Ben
there.
Whitmer,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so what's your knowledge of that and your experience of that? Like, what does that mean? What is that for you?
Yeah, I mean, so I had two books published over there in France. I had my book Corrosion, and then The Incurables. I got to go to France for the first one, Corrosion. It was such a great professional experience because they flew me out there, went on like a 5-city tour, and in
Yeah.
France, authors are viewed in a much different way than they are in America. In America, it's just kind of like, oh, whatever, dime a dozen. But in France, they're really venerated there, and so for that one week, you kind of feel like a rock star, and um, it was awesome going to all those things and having readers who had read it and had interesting questions ready for you. And one of the guys that was published by my publisher Gallmeister is Craig Johnson, who writes the Longmire
Mm-hmm.
books. And so we had shared the same publisher, and he was there at the same time as me. And so I was there. I was like trying to, I was trying to ingratiate myself to the French. I was doing my best to speak a little French because I took it in high school for forever, and I'm so bad, but I gave it a shot. But Craig Johnson just came. He had his big old cowboy hat there, and he was just like, "Howdy, how you guys doing?" And the French just loved him. And so, like, when we had these tables out there, and every few minutes somebody would come up to my table and talk to me, and Craig had this like line out the door for hours and hours on end. But I think French people in general, I mean, the term noir obviously is French, and so I think
Right.
they tend to resonate with some of that dark stuff. Unfortunately, talking to my publisher there, he says that stuff has started to not sell as much as it used to. So when I had sent him my more recent stuff, he's like, I'm kind of starting to go away from that kind of noir writing, because even in France, it's not selling the way it used to.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was something that had at least slowed down, if not run its course, because like I feel like I saw everybody going over there for a while. I think even maybe Matthew McBride as well is another
Yep, you
name
did.
that
You
comes to
did.
mind. Which fucking I love his books. So um, yeah. But anyway, but that was a phenomenon that I loved because like these authors who I knew who like in the like kind of view like you were saying the vast landscape of like American literature, it's hard to stand out or build momentum sometimes, especially if you're primarily publishing on smaller presses. But to see them over there feeling loved and appreciated and recognized for their talent, I thought, man, I'm really happy that that's a thing that's happening. It's really cool.
Yeah, it was cool. And like I know Ben Whitmer in particular had a lot of success over there. And even though they wouldn't publish his books here, he couldn't find a
Yeah.
publisher for several of his novels here in the States, but in France they really dug it and ate it up. And yeah, I mean that's one of my like certainly one of my peaks as far as professional moments and disappointments that I wasn't able to have more books over there. I haven't given up hope. Actually, that publisher Gallmeister's it has the memory award right now. I don't know if that would,
Mhm.
appeal to their press or not, but he's a really cool guy. And so never say never, but it seems like maybe that ship has sailed, at least for me.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if winds are shifting too, because so an example that comes to mind is Craig Clevenger. He had his book, The Contortionist Handbook, with a French publisher for a long time when the folks in the United States weren't really interested in like reissuing it. And that French release never manifested, but he recently had it re-released in the United States under Datura, which I guess is a UK publisher. Um, but I'm wondering if like the winds are shifting a little bit more, where like more of that stuff is coming back into the focus in the United States, possibly.
I hope so. I mean, the way publishing is, it's always just like if something works, we're going to try to get more and more of that. So if one person has some success doing something like that, that's what they're going to be looking for next. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's just kind of like styles, how styles kind of circle in and out, and then the next thing you know, people are wearing bell bottoms again. And so I guess my books are like bell bottoms over there, and hopefully that'll come back in style eventually.
Totally. But like now I'm thinking like S.A. Cosby getting on Barack Obama's like list of books he loves. Like that guy, great for him that happened for him. But that had to have helped anybody who was writing fiction like that. Because if someone read Cosby and was like, "Ooh, I love this," what do I go for now? So hopefully there's like a ripple from like sometimes we'll get like a real high um what's the word about high exposure kind of situation, and then like maybe it shines light on other things. So
Yeah, it
that's
was
one
good.
example where I was thinking maybe Cosby's little like cool moment could help out other folks too.
Yeah, I hope so. It was cool with Cosby just because it kind of felt like one of us had hit it so big because he
Yeah.
was, he started out in little small presses and, uh, he blurbed one of my books. We were just kind of in that same crowd.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, I knew he was a great writer with, kind of explosive plots and so forth. But then he just totally explodes. And then the next thing he's on the Jimmy Fallon show, and he's with Barack Obama. It's just it's crazy. It's got to be mind blowing for him too, especially
Yeah.
I know his background coming from come place with no money, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden like being this big. Good for him. He's a cool guy and a great writer.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely humble origins. And I feel like though he's got a love for his community. And so hopefully that, that attention, yeah, again, touches other folks in the community.
Yeah,
Yeah, I got to talk to him and he was like a really nice dude, but you can tell he was just like enthusiastic. He's of that type of person that is my favorite, which is like he's just so enthusiastic and he loves that stuff, books, the stories, like
yeah.
that he's so into it. And yeah, so that I always love talking to folks like that. So let's talk about where Memory Ward sits because in general, I've seen like Beneath Cruel Waters, is very solidly, at least in like Barnes and Noble and stuff, dropped in mystery thriller. I don't know how Blackstone is kind of pushing this one, like what audience they're looking for, but I feel like it kind of splits both. I feel like a great argument could be made for this being like a suspenseful thriller, but also, damn, there's some horror moments in there. So like, I feel like it can kind of live in both worlds. But do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I've always considered myself a genre writer, but I've never been totally sure of what my genre is.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, I know I write dark stuff, um, but as you know, like genre is a way for bookstores to organize and
yeah.
for readers to have some expectation. But even like with Beneath Cruel Waters, when it was put into thriller, it's definitely not. Whenever I hear thriller, I'm thinking about chase scenes and like
Yeah,
really fast moving plots. And Beneath Cruel Waters was much more of a kind of a slow burn, suspenseful, psychological. Um, and Memory Ward has like little bits and pieces of science fiction maybe in there. It's definitely got the suspense mystery thing, and then yeah, it's got pieces of horror. There's no supernatural stuff, and in my books I've never had supernatural
yeah,
stuff in there, which a lot of times I associate with horror. Um, so it's dark, it's
yeah,
suspenseful, and the stuff I write tends to be a little bit weird, and I think this book is weird. Like it's the same idea with I was kind of heavily influenced, I think, by David Lynch.
mm,
And even though this book, I wouldn't say it's not exactly Lynchian, but it's got some of those feels of like a town that seems idyllic, but there's some dark stuff going on underneath.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And so, one of the things I was thinking of is, so this is a type of story that automatically, when I'm reading, makes me think of other things that are like, it reminds me of stuff. Not saying that it was, that it's inspired from, but just like, oh man, this crazy shit is like this story. And even Gabino, in his blurb for you, he brought up Stepford Wives and Truman Show,
Yeah.
um, which totally get. I think that's an easy way to kind of connect someone who has no idea what's going on with the story with, like, what they might expect. The thing, there's two movies that came to mind for like what I would think. Like, I could finish reading your book and then go watch those and be like, oh, I'm in the same space. The
Hmm.
movie Memento,
Hmm.
um, that's Fincher, right? Am I?
No,
No.
Memento is oh gosh, what is his name? The guy who does Batman
Christopher Nolan.
for Nolan.
Nolan.
Yeah.
Yeah. For the unreliable narrator memory situation, but then also the number 23, like that. Do you remember that, or did you ever see that?
I've never seen that.
It's Jim Carrey, and he finds a book in a bookstore, and the whole premise of the book is that like the number 23 just like is this like kind of like number that you see everywhere, and it's like that crazy number theory where you can just fall down a rabbit hole about it.
Yeah.
But like he just kind of goes insane about that number, and there's like a twist about like where the book came from and stuff, but it's got that whole like memory and someone learning from someone before kind of thing. And so those two stories, like, I was reading yours and I was getting nostalgic for checking those out just because of like the structure of like your book focuses on um memory is like the main topic. And I think that where I think horror comes into this is just the how frightful it is if your mind is not a reliable source of information for you. And
Yeah.
so, that's like the real scary shit for me, is like, I can't imagine what it would feel like to be like, do I trust my memories or not? And so like, where did that, was that a fascination that you wanted to explore a little bit?
Yeah. It's like I've never written a series. Like every single one of my books is standalones, but I do think I come back a lot of times to certain obsessions, and I think of those obsessions, memory and identity are big ones. Um, and as someone who's who's not particularly religious, and we talk about like the human soul. I mean, the closest you can get, I would think, to the human soul is our memories and the narratives that we have about ourselves, of who we are. And when you begin to lose that, as you talk about, or not trust those memories, then the question is, well, what happens to your soul? You know,
Hmm.
does your soul still exist? And I also think it's just it. I think memory itself is such a fascinating topic. You know, where you might have two people who were together, who experience the same thing together, and have completely different memories of what happened. Um, and as far as the horror piece, you're right. For me, like, yeah, ghosts are scary and monsters are scary, but for me, the scariest thing has always been kind of that sense of losing your sanity
Yeah.
and mental illness and all the rest of it. And so there's a in this book there's a lot of I think there's a lot of paranoia that kind of creeps through, and that's it's one of the reasons. Even though the book, I think, sort of takes place in, it's sort of hard to tell, but contemporary times. But
Hmm.
there's a lot of like 1950s type feel to it, to the town, to even some of the music that's playing there. And I kind of did that purposefully because the 1950s seemed like such a sort of strange, paranoid time where
Yeah.
you did have all these, these with mass production, you had all these new towns popping up in the suburbs and so forth. But obviously, in post World War II, there's also just a lot of dark stuff there, and people dealing with memory and memory loss, and so I thought it would be kind of cool to have that 1950s setup. And some people have said, "Oh, I got Twilight Zone vibes," and that wasn't necessarily, I wasn't thinking of Twilight Zone when I wrote this, but it kind of fits with, again, like that 1950s feel.
Yeah. Something that kind of I got pushed to think about in this, as far as like memories and kind of like how it tells us what, tells us who we are and everything, is like, if um this might spoil stuff, so I might not be able to say it, but like, I'll say it, and I can delete it if we're worried about it spoiling anything. But like, um kind of a like a ship of Theseus kind of thing, but with your brain, where like, if you replace all these different parts, that's ship of Theseus, right? Where like all the different pieces get replaced, and then it's not the same. Is it the same thing anymore? Um,
I'll trust
that
you. My son told me about that recently, so, but I'll trust you on that.
I really hope I'm not saying that wrong and getting it, you know, looking stupid. But that whole concept of like, if you replace this part with something new, and eventually everything is replaced with something new, and there's no original parts anymore, is it the same ship or not? And
Yeah.
so the way that your story unfolds and everything kind of gave me that kind of feeling too. Like, if we start to question our memories, um, how do we hold on to who we are? How
Yeah.
do we know that we are the person that we were born, or something like that? And so, yeah, that gave me that kind of feel to it a little bit. But even like, so building on something you said before, um, how unreliable memories are in general, before anything fucks with them. I had a very solid memory of what my first memory was, and it was my second birthday. For a long time, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember my second birthday. And then I saw a picture and I'm like, oh, I remember seeing that picture of my second birthday, and I turned it into a memory. So like, it's already unreliable. It's already at risk. And so if anything tries to mess with it, we're so susceptible to, like, now I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, they say that every time you remember something, the memory changes because you're remembering it with that new narrative, and so it's kind of like that operator game where you
Yeah.
keep whispering and it keeps changing a little bit. But I have that same experience where I have this clear memory of finding the first. We had like this tomato plant, and I remember finding the first tomato and being so proud. But there's a picture of me with the tomato, and most likely I was really young. Most likely that memory is from seeing that picture and not
Yeah.
from the actual event itself. And um, yeah, and you can imagine being when you're young. it would be a lot easier for people to kind of manipulate your memories. And then if you're somebody who has gone through some trauma and you have the right person there ready to manipulate, that could happen as well. And and there's some of those things that happen in the memory ward.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, in such a fascinating way. And so one of the things that I think is a aspect of the book that kind of like the story moving along kind of hinges on is the unreliability of the narrator. And so, and I know some people cringe at people saying unreliable narrator, but in this case, the narrator is the person whose memory is affected. And so, or might be affected, I guess. There's
Yeah.
a possibility that their memory might be in question. And so there's an inherent ambiguity, but to me, um, the way that you reveal information and move the story forward had to be real careful to make sure that like the level of uncertainty then was like a door opened to now we're reframing how we think about things, and then we build off of that information, and then the next door opens. So I feel like it could be easy to mess that up. So was that a challenge for you to like maintain the right balance of like what we do know and what we don't know, or what we think we know?
Oh yeah. I mean, that was the biggest challenge with this one because you're I mean, as a writer, generally speaking, one of the hardest things to determine to balance is what to reveal and when. And that can depend too on what point of view you decide to take. If you're writing something in first person, is there any reason why your first person narrator would not want to reveal something to the readers? How honest is your first person narrator? If you're doing it in like a third person omniscient type voice, well then don't you owe it to your audience to be completely honest and to tell them everything, since this is sort of like a godlike narrator? But ultimately, it is the writer's call. Even if you're doing third person, I would argue that every narrator is unreliable. A third person omniscient narrator
Yeah.
is somebody, and that has their own biases and so forth. The challenge with this one was that um, there are several different first person narrators here,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of stories within stories within story. I mean, there's one part where there is like a story within a story within a story that you kind of have to keep track of those different levels. And so it's like you're thinking, well, first of all, what do the characters in the story know and when, and what are they
Yep.
trying to not reveal to each other? And then how do I kind of intersperse that with what do my readers know and when? And if you reveal too much to your readers, then they can become easily bored or saying this is obvious. And if you don't reveal enough, they can become frustrated because of how obtuse it was.
Yeah.
So, did my best to balance it. I don't know if I, you know, succeeded 100%. I'm sure some people will, say I went too far on one side or the other. But yeah, that was definitely the challenge of this book.
It's also as a reader, something that I really love is um the unknown compelling me forward, I guess, is like a simple way to say it. But that started at the very beginning of the book. So it's Hank. Henry Davies is the first
Yeah.
character that we see the story from, and he's a postal worker, and he's on his route, and he like trips or something happens out of like his normal routine, and he realizes like, oh, this envelope is open, and he looks at it, and the pages inside are blank. And from a reader's perspective, I'm like, what the fuck is happening here?
Yeah.
And I need to follow this story to see what's going on. So immediately his curiosity is my curiosity, and I'm on the ride, man. I'm just like, so I feel like that initial hook was just like almost like drugs. It was so, I was in so hard, and I just wanted to follow this and and figure out what the hell's going on in this place. And so yeah, congratulations at in general to the fact that like that's the way that starts, because I feel it is like a propulsive way to begin the story.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I thought it was pretty compelling. Usually I'm used to as somebody who's kind of come out of like, I don't know, the pulp tradition where I always felt like I had to early on in my writing, just sort of shock and stun, and from page one have something crazy like, violent or whatever. This one was a little bit more subtle than usual, but I think anytime you are questioning what is going on here, as for me as a reader, those are the kind of books that I enjoy reading the most, and so that's why I wanted to try to write those. I really enjoy. I don't know if you've read anything by Ian Reid, but he's a guy who, again, it's one of those things where like something's not quite right from the first couple pages. Like there's something that's just weird and off, and something's off, but you're in that same place as the character who's trying to figure it out as well. And so um, I guess that's what I was trying to do here, as you mentioned, like you're
Yeah.
trying to figure things out with the character.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then there's the sense, I think, especially with paranoia, there's the sense that he starts to sense that other people know something that he doesn't. Uh,
Hmm.
and it's that old saying, like, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean somebody's not chasing after you. And a lot of the novel is his paranoia? Is there some rationale behind his paranoia, or is he just paranoid? Is he just kind of losing it?
You definitely inject doubt from like the other characters, the external characters, but also from like the narrator characters who are like paranoid, but also sometimes questioning themselves a little bit. Um, but like, so I'm trying to think of the way to introduce this topic in a way that, because it's a little confusing to myself, but so like that blank pages in the envelope in the mail, like the letter that's being mailed to someone, and then like the pages inside are blank. My mind takes that as like an objective fact, but the way that the story unfolds kind of tells me that I shouldn't necessarily think it's an objective fact. So I guess my question to you is, do you see there are certain points in the book where there is an actual objective fact that we can cling on to, or is everything kind of unclear?
That's a good question. I would just say, that would be a big philosophical question about whether there is any kind of objective truth. And
Mhm.
I teach high school English, and we've had that conversation in my class. Like, is there anything that is absolutely true? And we can kind
Sure.
of go on with that. I would say, as a writer, um, I think it would be kind of dishonest for me not to know what my truth is in writing
Yeah.
it. So because then it could be like, well, it could be this way or it could be that, and I don't have to come clean at all, because nothing is there. There's no such thing as truth, anyways. So I feel like I know what really happened in the story. I feel like I know what the truth, the so-called truth is.
Uh-huh.
But that doesn't mean that that's the truth that the narrator has, or that the truth that the reader is going to have. And when I gave this to my editor, and we were working on it, at the very, I won't spoil what happens at the end, obviously, but at the end, she had one interpretation about what happened. She said, "Is that what happened?" And I said, "No, it's the other thing." And she said, "Oh, okay." She's like, "I'm glad. I feel like that's better,
Yeah.
but I just wasn't sure." So yeah, I do think it's important for the author to be honest. I mean, I get frustrated sometimes when I'm watching, like a TV show that has the 6 or 8 episodes in the year, and you're waiting and waiting for some kind of a resolution at the end, and then it's pushed back to the next season, and you start wondering, well, do they even know, like,
Right.
why these weird things are happening? Because it's one thing to just make weird things happen, and like, well, that's odd. Why did that happen? But it's another thing to have like a reason behind it that's kind of satisfying. And
Hmm.
I think sometimes, not calling any names, I think sometimes writers can get a little lazy and just say, I'm going to throw all this weird stuff out there, and I don't really need to answer it, because people will just kind of keep reading to try to figure out why these weird things are happening.
Yeah. I was talking about this earlier today with some like coworkers. And the example that I was using was I haven't watched the entire series of Game of Thrones because friends like, you got to check out the show, it's great. And I watched the first season. I was like, yeah, this isn't for me. And he's like, no, 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 you got to keep going.
Yeah.
And I watched the second season and I was like, it's just not doing it for me. And he's like, no, 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 keep going. And I watched the third season. I was like, I'm done, man. You're not going to convince me to watch anything more. And the thing that I realized, the problem for me as a viewer, and I'm not a writer, I'm not a storyteller. So like, I interpret things as like the consumer.
Right.
The problem that I had with that was it never paid anything off along the way. It just told you something's coming.
Yeah.
This will happen. That's going to happen. And it never paid off anything. Like maybe there's small things here and there, but like there wasn't like arcs that completed and then another arc that completed. It was just a nonstop build. And I'm assuming for 8 seasons. And so that by the time you get to the end of that 8th season, you've made so much promise without any type of payoff where how can you possibly make anybody happy with the way that that ends?
Yeah.
Like you didn't give them anything along the way, so they're just hanging on their hopes onto this very last moment. It's impossible to satisfy people, and I think that yeah, I think that that's
Well,
one
and
of
I wonder if it probably is purposeful. I mean, you think about like the way we live with social media. I mean, you're always you're scrolling, scrolling, scrolling,
mhm.
trying to find that whatever it is you're trying to find. You're trying to find some satisfaction. You kind of feel like, well, maybe if I scroll for a little bit longer, or
Yeah,
I'll check my email over and over again, waiting for that. The movie person's going to send me this great email soon. Just kind of keep
yep,
checking, waiting for that hit. And I was watching a show with my son. I don't remember what it was, but it kind of ended that way where like, okay, now we have to wait for the next season because the questions were not answered. And he was
yeah,
really frustrated. And I said, the problem, if they resolved everything, then they did a season two, we might watch season two or we might not because we already felt satisfied with season one.
yeah,
We had our resolution, so we're kind of good. Maybe we'll watch season two because it was interesting, but we don't have to because we have the resolution. If we don't have the resolution, then we feel compelled. We got to watch season two, and then we watch season three, and we keep getting strung along with this promise that
yeah,
eventually we're going to give it to you. There's some shows that I think doing a better job of like, all right, at the end of each season, we're going to give you some resolution, and then we're going to give you some other threads that you're going to need for the next one.
yeah.
I've really enjoyed watching Severance. I don't know if you've watched
Mhm.
any of that, but like,
I need to, yeah,
yeah. But the first season, there's also, I think you'd really like it because just with the kind of the weird, what is going on here, the
yeah,
strange questions and so forth. And the first season ended with like some resolution, but also a lot of, all right, there's other things we just don't know.
yeah.
And I think that's fair, to do it that way.
Hmm. I would imagine that it would be beneficial to someone to like not have everything connected to one specific like layer of a story. Like there's just one layer to the story. If you have like a big layer and then you have smaller layers and the smaller layers can start and end while the bigger thing is still going on, I feel like then you just have room to breathe because you can say, this isn't working. We're going to end this and let's just introduce a different thing. Like a little bit of a modular approach to like like a bigger story. There can be small pieces that come and go. I feel like that I just don't like the idea of we're starting with one promise and we're just piling promises on until it's just unfinishable. You
Yeah.
know,
Well, and I
um,
guess that's some of the question of like the way people write. I mean, not to oversimplify it, but they talk about how there's the planners and then the pantsers, the people who plan
mm,
everything out, and the people who just kind of just see where it goes. And I've
yeah,
always been a planner because I always felt like, all right, I need to know where all these little pieces fit, and so I can pull everything together there at the end.
hmm,
And I worry about if you're just going in and just kind of making up as you go, like you can always add these intriguing things, but are you really going to be able to tie things up in a
yeah,
way that makes sense and satisfying for people? And I'm sure that like there definitely are some writers who are brilliant and who are able to do that and able to just like, it just kind of comes magically for them. But I'm not one of those guys. I do need that like I need to have my blueprint of what's going to happen in my
yeah,
book before I start writing it.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, and I'd imagine because I was talking about the complexity of this story, having a blueprint was probably pretty important to making sure that you kept all the plates spinning and pacing in a situation like this is like got to be complicated because you've got one, two, three, at least three different narrators, depending on how you count. Uh,
Yeah.
um, and how do you make sure that you don't have like, unless it's like part of the story, like that how do you maintain a consistent pace when you're going from this person to this person? So that had to be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, so what I did was I had, each of my characters, I kind of wrote out their basically their lives chronologically. All right, here's what happened to them, these dates. This is the order. And then you can kind of cross reference your other characters, and then you as the author can decide, all right, how now what order am I going to tell this in? Where am I
Yeah.
going to start with this? But I do think you need to know more about the characters than is actually on the pages themselves. So like,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
because you're not, you're not starting with their birth and going to their death. You're deciding what part of their life you're going to be talking about. And so much of these, kind of especially psychological stories are based on things that have already happened that we're not told about. That's what's psychological about them, and that we as the reader might slowly figure them out, and the protagonist or the narrator might slowly figure them out as well.
Yeah. Um, Kind of to that point, one of one of the parts of the books that's it's really kind of a heavy shift is going into the part of the book that's from the perspective of Catherine Gordon,
Hmm.
which I found fantastic. I loved the whole Catherine Gordon thing, and um, it's fun because we start with Henry, and we're like getting into what's going on, and then this is kind of like a peek into another life where they had a very similar experience before, and so now it's like I'm not alone.
Yeah.
I'm this other person, is the things that they said reinforce the things that I'm experiencing. And what I think that I like about the story, and like your whole idea of like different readers are going to have different interpretations, and that's good. um some readers might be like, well, is this person's delusion feeding this person's delusion, or is this person's reality helping this person feel what reality is? And so yeah, having those different characters and their experiences kind of feed into the overall story either made things more clear or more unclear depending on how you read it. I
Yeah.
feel.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and I hadn't really thought of it in those terms necessarily, but it's a good way of thinking of it. When you're by yourself and you're having these strange things that are going on, it's easy to say, this person is delusional. There's something
Yeah.
wrong with this person. When you have a second person who's experiencing the same thing, maybe not. You have a third person, but then on the other side, delusions can be brought on by the masses, right? I mean, we see
Yeah.
the way social media can work, and we see the way conspiracy theories are. So if enough people start saying things, they might start convincing you. So it can go either way. And I
Yeah.
think that's what happens here. And at some point, I think in this story, most people will kind of take a side. You'll say, all right, I think this is what's happening here, or somebody will say, nah, I think this is delusional. I think they're
Yeah.
they're sharing this delusion, and the side that you pick might depend on kind of your own experiences with, whether it's with mental illness, or whether it's with memory loss, or whether it's with conspiracies and paranoia. Um, that might kind of feed into your perspective on it as well.
Yeah. And there's been a theme for me lately in just life and observing things about um, the concept of not being heard or not being listened to, and like how psychologically damaging it can be for someone to just not be believed. And so, like there can be traumas, there can be like problems that occur in your life if people don't listen to the thing you're saying, like if it's a medical thing or something like that, or if it's like you're in a bad relationship and no one believes it's bad, really horrible things can happen to you. And so like I've had in my mind a lot lately, the idea of like not being heard or listened to or believed. And so um, this kind of also unearthed, it kind of connected to that. So obviously there's the kind of direct idea of like what happens in the story, but it also kind of like taps into a more general feeling of like when you're going through something and you're not supported or believed, or if you feel like you're being pushed in a direction that is against your best interests, like how, going back to horror, how horrible that can feel.
Yeah, for sure. And like in the, in the that opening scene where you're talking about, where the where Hank has several different envelopes and all of them, according to him, have blank piece of paper in them. He goes home and tells his wife, and he
Mm-hmm.
says, "Look, this is what happened." And instead of supporting him,
Yep.
she kind of freaks out on him and says, you are not allowed to look at these envelopes. What are you doing? You took an oath and all this stuff. So he's not
Yeah.
supported. And then there's other narrators, later on, who experience kind of not being supported by doctors, or getting their concerns dismissed in that way. And um, and you have one character, you have one of these narrators who is named Walter, or Wally. And Wally has, his father is somebody who's not very trustworthy, because he's suffering from delusions or dementia, or whatever the case might be. So you have this case where you're the narrator, you're wondering about his memories, as he is taken care of, as kind of the caretaker of somebody else who's really struggling with memories too. So you can kind of pile on to each other there.
Yeah. And I love books that challenge me that way, because that's another one where I think some of the observations about the behaviors of that father are kind of a tell, but it's only a tell if I believe the person who's interpreting what's going on. And so that ambiguity persists. And so, yeah, it's just a nice, I think you created a nice um, atmosphere of questioning and figuring it out. But really, at the end of the day, you gave people kind of not the work, but you gave it to them to say what is your interpretation of this.
Oh, well, thank you. That's definitely what I was trying to do. So I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. And now I'm definitely questioning my interpretation of everything. But I guess so in that regard, one thing that had occurred to me to ask you was, and you can feel free to be as vague or just not answer the question as you want to, but did you leave any kind of Easter eggs in the book that would definitely kind of push someone in one direction over another?
Um, I don't know if you can ever say definite, just because you are always relying on one person's perspective, right? So
Hmm.
if you choose to view that person's perspective as unreliable. I mean, you were talking about how kind of horrifying it is if somebody doesn't believe you when you're suffering from something. Well, I mean, here we have our narrators, and the question is whether the readers believe them or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I do feel like in the last scene, there are a couple of little things that I leave there, which to me would push it in one direction. Um, but yeah, I don't think there's anything that would be like, oh yeah, if you see this, you'll definitely know
Yeah.
the answer.
I love it. My mind, when I read stories, my mind looks for rules in general. And so, like, with the structure of this story, obviously, I pretty much immediately understood that, like, rules aren't going to be helpful. But I always look for a rule. And then if I find a rule, I look for it being followed or being violated. And, like, that's one of the ways that I help myself interpret the story is if they said, if this, then that, and I see the if this, I'm looking for either did they do that or did they do the other thing? And what does that mean? And so, like, yeah, my mind really tries to break down like what's the story telling me that helps me interpret what's going on. So you might think that sounds like I would be frustrated by a book that's heavily ambiguous, but I fucking love it. I love the idea of being like kind of in the dark and trying to feel my way around.
Oh, good. Now, so when you're reading, are you somebody who's always like trying to figure it out while you're reading, or you just kind of go along for the ride?
100% trying to figure it out.
It's funny because I'm a writer who writes those kind of stories. But when I'm reading or watching a show, for the most part, I'm just like, I'm just going to watch and go along and
Yeah.
sort of trust that I'll get somewhere at the end.
Yeah.
Whereas like when I'm watching with my son, he's constantly trying to, every second, like, wait, I noticed this, and it's just two different ways of taking in your content, I guess.
Yeah. I'll give you a perfect example of how my mind works and like how it could be annoying to like, especially like watching something with me. I was watching John Wick with someone, and obviously this is a long time ago, but there was a scene in like a club somewhere, and he's like going to find the guy that killed his puppy. And at one point, there's this like long, drawn out scene of him just like killing all these like club people. And I turn to the person I'm with, and I'm like, all the bad guys are wearing the same color tie. They have the same uniform, and
Yeah.
that's how you know they're bad. And they're like, "How did you fucking notice that?"
Yeah, I definitely would not have noticed that.
Yeah,
That's cool.
I find patterns like my mind is looking for, because here's what it is. I know it's a story that someone chose to tell.
Yeah.
So either the storytelling or the direction and production and costuming and everything, somewhere along the line, I know someone made a choice that's telling us something without telling us something.
Yeah.
So like I'll be like, yeah, do you know why they're wearing that shirt? It's because of this. And
Well, and it's gotten harder and harder for writers to really surprise people because people like you are like very sophisticated, and so as a writer you're trying to like, all right, if I've got this sophisticated reader who's thinking this, I need to
yeah,
allow him or her to think this, and then do that. I mean, I remember
yeah,
seeing The Sixth Sense when it came out, and like being, and again, I was somebody just along for the ride. I wasn't trying to figure things out, but then the end twist, being so blown away, like
yeah.
I felt like the world had changed. And then whereas my nephew, different generation, we were so excited to show him this movie, and then like 20 minutes in, he's like, "Oh," and just blurted out the solution to the movie. I'm like, how did you possibly know that? He's like, because of
um,
this and this. And
yep. Yeah, but I don't think that there's. And here's what I'll say: there's not a right way or a wrong way to enjoy something.
yeah,
There's just your way, and so like I think it's completely valid to just be along for the ride. Um, my mind won't let me do that,
yeah,
and so uh, I have to see like what's the story telling me. But I almost, and I think that's one of the reasons I really love like Paul Tremblay's stuff, is because he doesn't always give me the permission to do that. And I think that this book is a great example of like the way that you framed it, and especially after just explaining it to me. Um, I think you're right. I think that it's, and obviously I'm going to go back and read the kind of final scene and see if I can pick up some stuff. But I don't think that you give us ever. I don't think there's ever like a crack that we can see through. I feel like it is a really tight setup where it's kind of on you to you the reader to come to your best conclusion.
yeah, and decide who you trust. I mean, you
Yeah.
you you trust one person or you trust another, and you kind of have to decide which of these people is more trustworthy.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but yeah, I love Tremblay's stuff too, and I love the ambiguity in the way a lot of his books end.
Yeah.
And I know some people get frustrated with it, and I get that too. Like I do, but I don't feel like Tremblay is ever being dishonest with it. I feel
Hmm.
like it's you can have ambiguity without being dishonest. You can also be dishonest and just say, I'm not going to, I refuse to tell you what happened here. But I don't think that's what Tremblay does, and that's what I like about it, about his stuff.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think he approaches it very earnestly, and it's not like he's doing it because it's his thing. It's just that's the right thing for the story. Is kind of the feel I got for it.
Yeah.
Um, a good example of this was I recently talked to Chuck Wendig for his book, The Staircase in the Woods,
Hmm.
which I think comes out in April, and it has an ambiguous ending. Like basically, the final scene, and I'm not spoiling anything. The final scene sets up something's about to happen, but it cuts off before you get to see what that thing is. when I was talking to him, I was like, "Do you know what happened?" He's like, "I wrote it," and he told me, and he's like, "I wrote it. This is what I wrote." Obviously, that's not in the podcast. That's cut, but
Oh, he wrote the ending and just didn't
yep,
include that.
right. So he wrote it, and then in edits and in the process of like kind of finalizing the book, the decision was made to kind of like back it off to a point. And I was like, that was a smart decision, because had I gotten through the thing you just told me, it would have been a satisfying ending and everything. But like the way that it did end, where all of that stuff was about to happen, and it was up to you to kind of like fill in that blank,
Yeah,
that it ended on much more of a swell, if that makes sense. Like it really kind of like ended on like this like big upturn, whereas like if it ended the way he did, that upturn would have turned into kind of like a flat kind of resolution. And so I think he ended it where it made you feel the most.
yeah,
um
that's
so I
cool. I
think,
mean, yeah, or sort of ending it where there's still stuff floating around in your head as
yeah.
the reader, and the unknown is always kind of more mystical than the known is, right? So having some unknown can be, you know, not saying this for my book, but just having some unknown can almost be spiritual, like as
Yeah,
as you finish a book.
yeah, absolutely. But I will say selfishly that knowing what actually happened is kind of fun.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was not part of the reading experience. I just got it after the fact, but that's kind of cool too. Um, I had a note that I didn't touch on, and it doesn't really kind of follow the continuum of our discussion, but I wanted to say something about one of the things that was creepier for me in the story. And so throughout the story, we're seeing things from different narrators' perspectives, different people who are going through their own kind of thing. And like in one, so um, Hank has his wife,
hmm
Wally has his dad, Catherine's got her husband, um, and there's always this doctor who's like showing up to like make sure, because the theme there's kind of a common theme where like there's been an accident and they're being cared for, and so
right.
this doctor has to show up. um and one of the creepiest things, unsettling, or just thing that didn't sit right with me, that gave me the feeling of like, ugh, like this is gross. I guess they would say nowadays, they would say the ick,
hmm
is there was several scenes throughout the book where someone is the we're with the narrator, and in another room people are laughing about stuff.
Yeah,
And it didn't happen just once, it happened a few times, or at least a couple of times. And whenever the people were like laughing in the other room, for me that was just so unsettling. There was something like, you don't know why they're laughing, the situations that they're in don't necessarily like lend to laughing, but there is simultaneously a very simple explanation or a very sinister explanation, and you're stuck thinking like, am I overthinking this, or is this a tell, is this like a break in their act or whatever. So
yeah,
that was one of the things in the book that was the most like kind of creepy for me, was like just the simple thing of hearing people joking and laughing in the other room.
yeah. Well, I mean, because our narrators, it's obvious, felt like there was a joke being played on them. And
Yeah,
I think even one of the narrators, said is I don't know if he used those exact terms, but something about is everybody just playing a joke on me here?
yeah,
And so it is unsettling. And sometimes they would just get a simple, you just told me a joke, and here's the joke I told them, and it was funny. But it does happen more than once, and it plays into the paranoia that the characters feel, that everybody knows something except for them, and that's
yeah.
that's a like that's a really lonely feeling. And maybe that feeling becomes a little less lonely when they find each other. These three different characters begin finding each other, um, but there is a sense of like, even townspeople, if they're not laughing, kind of smiling behind their backs at them. And
Hmm.
as you say, it could be totally innocent. People smile. They don't mean anything by it, or it could mean that, yeah, we know something you don't know.
They're all in on something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super. Yeah. Super creepy. But again, like it walks that line of it. It could be an easy explanation, or it could be paranoia. But then I also like the idea of when you were talking about that, like other people. If you're in this paranoid state of what's going on, and you find out someone else is in a similar paranoid state about what's going on, I would hope at the very least that you kind of hesitate before putting all your eggs in someone else's crazy basket, but like if they're the last thing that you have to cling to that like feels right or makes sense, like you maybe would just kind of just dive all into whatever they're saying. So the whole story, like, dude, I don't know, man. It really gets you thinking.
No, I appreciate it. Just got me thinking when you said that. I had a friend who suffered from some kind of paranoid thinking, and I don't know if it was like schizophrenia, but he started hearing voices, and he had a brother who was 2 years older than him, and he told me that he and his brother heard the same voices, and that kind of freaked, and
Wow.
there is some sort of medical explanation for that or some diagnosis for that, kind of the shared delusion. But yeah, both of
That's
them.
all I do. Yeah.
Oh, and he told me, he's like, the voices are real. They're there. It's just that me and my brother are the only ones who can actually hear them. And yeah,
Oh
so
man. That is just, that is, yeah. That, how do you deal with that? But then that makes me think of, I saw something on social media recently where it was a person who suffers from visual hallucinations. They'll see people that aren't there. And I don't know if it's necessarily a function of schizophrenia specifically or something else, but they have visuals hallucinations. And they said, but my visual hallucinations don't show up in my phone's camera.
mm,
So if I'm seeing someone and I'm not sure they're really there, I hold up my phone. And if they're
mm,
not in my phone, I know they're not there. And I was like, what? And here's the thing. It's not the technology that's doing that. It's the mind's interpretation of how the world works. That's got to be the thing that's making that happen, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like the vampire not appearing in the mirror or something, right? It's
Yeah, it's crazy. So like, but that, like the idea that two people can hear the same voice is mind blowing, but at the same time, like it's their, yeah, I don't know. It's a lot to think about.
yeah. Sorry about that.
No, it's cool. But that just like, I think this one of the scare, there's like, to me there's the two scariest things in the world are our own minds and the ocean. um and so like I love playing in the sandbox of like, how does the mind work, how reliable is it, that kind of stuff, I think is endlessly fascinating. So the moment I read like the introduction to what your story was, I was like, I'm reading this. I immediately wanted to read it, and I was just in from that first moment where ostensibly the letters are blank. So yeah, like just a real gripping like start, and such a great story.
Thanks. I'll have to add oceans into my next one.
You can I mean, are you not afraid of like,
Oh, I'm terrified. I mean,
yeah,
I can barely swim too, so I mean, I can swim fine except for when the water gets deep. Then I start panicking. So yeah, I'm terrified of the ocean, but I'm terrified of heights. I'm scared of everything.
I love it when people who write horror or are horror adjacent are big scaredy cats. I think that's the most honest approach to writing horror is like, you're scared too.
Yeah, well, that's why we write it. Like if you understand what it's like to be scared, it's easier to write it. If you're never scared of anything, it's probably pretty hard to write something scary because you can't empathize with that
Yeah, there's no
experience.
empathy there.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I was tinkering with whether I wanted to talk about this or not. And this may not go anywhere, but there was a point in the book where I was like, oh, is time going to be a factor in how this story plays out? And yeah, so I feel like this isn't like a chronological telling of stories. Obviously, like Catherine Gordon's story was written before, other stories because, um, you know, like they're read by Walter. But so I guess what I'm dancing around and worried about asking is um, like, are we to believe that the story isn't told in a strictly like chronological order?
Yeah, I mean, again, I feel like as the writer, I've got everything chronologically and in its right place. And I feel like everything that happens that we read could fit into the time scheme that we have, but we are presented with it out of chronological order. So it would be
Mm-hmm.
it would be sort of taking those pieces and putting them back into place. But
Mm-hmm.
I feel pretty confident that the pieces would fit into
Yeah.
place. That
Yeah.
was definitely something we spent a long time with my editor, like just with years and so forth. Wait, this happened this year. When would this? And um, yeah, so it is like not exactly a chronological retelling in the way the narrative's written, but
Right.
there is a chronological story, I believe.
Awesome. There is a solid chronology to it.
Yes,
Awesome.
yes, yes.
And then kind of finally to wrap things up, if anybody is kind of new to reading you, I've got some books on my shelf behind me. I've got Corrosion there. I've got The Memory Word, obviously. I've got The Drive Through Crematorium,
Mhm.
um, Incurables.
The Incurables, yep.
I said it right. And then Lantern Man. So like if someone starts with Memory Ward, I don't have Beneath Cruel Waters, but I know of it. If someone starts with Memory Ward, where would you think like would be a decent, is there a recommended like trajectory to go through your stuff, or is it just go wild and enjoy what you want
I
to?
mean, I would say go wild. I would say the novels that are the closest to the Memory Ward as far as feel are concerned might be a Drive Through Crematorium, and then another one called Captain Clive's Dream World. Those are all kind of weird and deal a lot with memory and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I feel like go just pick a cover that you like and or pick a
Yeah.
description that you like and go with it.
Is is there anything that's not readily available in print right now that I should just
I
like if
think
I'm like, guys, watch or read Corrosion, can people find the like the older
Yeah,
stuff?
I think so. I think everything's available. Not everything is on audio. I think there's a couple
Mm-hmm.
books that are not on Audible, but most of them are. Blackstone, the publisher, has done a nice job of getting a lot of my backlist back up
That's
on
awesome.
Audible. But yeah, you should be able to find everything in print. There might be like maybe with a couple of the older ones, maybe it's one of those like where it'll take a week to get to you, but
Sure.
certainly with the last couple, Memory Ward and Beneath Cruel Waters, those are obviously
Easy
readily
peasy.
available in a lot of bookstores and so forth.
Is there anything that's currently on the horizon that's coming soon or that you're working on?
Well, it's funny when a book comes out. Like, I mean, I probably finished the Memory Ward 3 years ago. So I've since then I've actually written two other books.
Sure.
They're both with my agent, and so those are kind of on submission and out with publishers, and Blackstone will be reading them as well. So hopefully one or both of those will appear eventually. And then a couple of my books have been optioned. So the Drive Through Crematorium and the Disassembled Man, both optioned for films. Um, it sounds like the Drive Through Crematorium will probably film this year, but you never know. These things kind of change all the time, but it seems like it's in a pretty good spot. And then the Disassembled Man has been optioned for like a decade, and you know maybe one day it'll happen. I hope it does because I think it'll be a cool movie, but still waiting on that one. So, but
Oh,
keep, but
that's
keep your
awesome.
eyes out. Maybe one of these will hit the big screen. I hope so.
That'd be awesome. Well, John, I really appreciate you taking the time. For anybody who's listening or watching, the last time I interviewed John was December of 2015. So it's been 9 years
Yeah.
since we talked, but like I've obviously read stuff since then. But so it's great to reunite. It's nice to. I've always loved seeing your books when I'm out in the world and seeing them on the shelves and everything, and it's just great to reconnect with you and to do so with such an incredible book is just like the icing on the cake. So thanks so much for the great book and for talking to me today.
Well, I appreciate you so much. Thanks for reading it, and thanks for the great conversation. Those were wonderful questions. So thank you.